Neighbor stole my dead father's belongings and claimed he'd promised her everything. I made sure she got exactly what she deserved. My neighbor Ruth tried to take all my father's belongings when he passed away in March by claiming he'd promised everything to her for taking care of him, even though I was the one who spent every day by his side during his final months. The morning after my father died, before I'd even returned from the hospital, Ruth had already entered his house with a spare key she wasn't supposed to have and started loading his television into her truck. When I arrived to start funeral arrangements, I found Ruth in my father's bedroom packing his watches and jewelry into boxes while her son carried out his leather recliner. She said my father had verbally promised her everything in the house as payment for years of being a good neighbor and checking on him occasionally. I told her to leave immediately, but Ruth said possession was 9/10 of the law, and she'd already taken plenty while I was at the hospital holding my father's hand as he died. She actually said I should have been thinking about securing assets, instead of wasting time on someone who was already gone. She claimed my father had told her I was a disappointment who never visited, and she deserved his belongings more than his ungrateful daughter. This was completely false since I'd moved back home to care for him full-time for 8 months, but Ruth told anyone who'd listen that she was his real family. Ruth had already taken his military medals, his coin collection worth thousands, and his tools from the garage while I was planning his funeral. She said my father wanted her to have them because she appreciated their value while I'd probably just sell everything for drug money. She'd never seen me use drugs in my life but created this narrative to justify her theft. When I changed the locks, Ruth called the locksmith pretending to be me and had them changed again, giving herself the new keys. I found out when I couldn't get into my own father's house the day before his funeral. The locksmith confirmed a woman claiming to be the daughter had called and paid over the phone. Ruth was inside sorting through photo albums and taking the ones with any valuable historical photos, while leaving the regular family pictures scattered on the floor. She'd taken his computer, his filing cabinet with important documents, and even his prescription medications that she said she needed for her own health issues. When I confronted her with my father's will that left everything to me, Ruth said wills could be forged, and she had witnesses who'd heard my father promise her his belongings. These witnesses were her drinking buddies who'd never met my father but were willing to lie for a cut of whatever Ruth sold. That's when I decided Ruth needed to learn what it felt like to lose everything while grieving. I started by telling the neighborhood that Ruth was having severe memory issues and had been confused since her husband left her last year, which was true, but she'd hidden it from everyone. I said she'd been entering houses thinking they were hers and taking things she believed belonged to her. The neighbors started locking their doors and watching Ruth suspiciously whenever she was outside. Some started checking their garages and sheds, discovering things missing they hadn't noticed before. Next, I contacted Ruth's estranged daughter, Beth, who lived 2 states away, and told her about her mother's declining mental state and how she'd been hoarding stolen items. Beth had power of attorney from when Ruth had surgery years ago and had never revoked it. Beth was horrified to learn her mother had become a thief using grief as cover and immediately drove down to intervene. Beth found my father's belongings in Ruth's house along with items from at least 6 other neighbors who'd lost things over the years. While Ruth was at bingo, Beth and I moved everything out of Ruth's house that had been stolen, returning items to their rightful owners. The neighbors were shocked to find their missing tools, decorations, and even a bicycle in Ruth's spare room. Ruth came home to an empty house except for her own belongings, and Beth waiting with paperwork for a cognitive evaluation. Ruth stood at her living room window, arms crossed, watching me through the glass. I turned away and walked back to my father's house, my legs shaking so hard I had to grip the porch railing. The false witnesses were the real problem now. Ruth had built an entire story with people ready to back her up in court, and my father's will wouldn't mean anything if 3 people swore under oath that he'd promised everything to her. I needed help. Someone who could counter Ruth's lies with actual authority. Beth's name kept coming back to me from the Christmas cards my father used to read aloud every December. Ruth's daughter lived somewhere far away, Ohio maybe, and they hadn't spoken in years according to neighborhood gossip. If Beth still had that power of attorney paperwork from her mother's surgery, she could override Ruth's claims entirely. I just had to find her contact information before Ruth realized what I was planning. I went inside and headed straight for my father's filing cabinet in his den. Ruth had taken the computer and important documents, but she'd left the filing cabinet itself, probably because it was too heavy to move quickly. I pulled open the top drawer and started searching through folders of old tax returns and medical bills. The second drawer held insurance papers and warranty documents for appliances my father had owned 20 years ago. The bottom drawer was stuffed with personal correspondence, greeting cards rubber banded together by year, letters from relatives, postcards from vacations. I found the stack marked 2020 and flipped through Christmas cards until I spotted one with an Ohio return address. The card showed a snow-covered church, and inside, Beth's handwriting wished my father happy holidays and mentioned her job at Memorial Hospital in Columbus. I took 3 photos of the card with my phone, making sure the return address was clear in each shot. Through the window, I could see Ruth's curtains moving. She was still watching. I drove to a coffee shop 3 towns over that evening, parking in the back lot where Ruth wouldn't spot my car if she happened to drive by. Inside, I ordered tea I didn't want, and sat in the corner booth farthest from the windows. My hands shook as I pulled up the photos of Beth's Christmas card and dialed the phone number written under her return address. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, a woman answered, her voice tired and flat. I introduced myself as her mother's neighbor and said I was calling because I was worried about Ruth. I kept my voice calm and concerned, like I was reaching out to help rather than plotting revenge. I explained that Ruth had been confused lately, entering neighbors' houses and taking things that didn't belong to her. I framed everything as memory problems and cognitive decline, never mentioning my father's death or the deliberate theft of his belongings. Beth went quiet for several seconds. When she finally spoke, she sounded surprised that anyone from her mother's neighborhood even had her number. She admitted she hadn't talked to Ruth in almost 2 years, not since a huge fight about her mother's drinking and refusal to get help. I told her Ruth had been going into people's homes thinking they were hers, taking items she believed belonged to her, and the neighbors were getting worried. I said it gently, like I was sharing difficult news rather than setting a trap. Beth asked specific questions about her mother's behavior, wanting to know exactly what Ruth had taken and from whom. I kept my answers vague, mentioning tools and household items without bringing up my father. I could hear the worry in Beth's voice, mixed with something that sounded like guilt. Beth didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she started talking about how she'd been concerned about her mother for years, but felt helpless living 2 states away. She mentioned their estrangement, the drinking, the manipulation that had driven her father away last year. I listened and made sympathetic noises while my mind raced ahead to what I needed from her. When there was a pause in the conversation, I mentioned the power of attorney paperwork from her mother's surgery, asking if that was still valid. Beth sounded startled, like she'd completely forgotten about it. She said she thought she still had copies somewhere in her home office files. She'd need to dig through old boxes. But yes, the paperwork had never been formally revoked as far as she knew. We talked for almost an hour. I carefully planted information about Ruth's stories, how she'd been telling people my father promised her everything, how she claimed to be his real family while painting me as an ungrateful drug addict. I kept my tone worried rather than angry, expressing concern about Ruth's mental state rather than accusing her of deliberate theft. Beth sounded exhausted and guilty as she talked about her mother's lifelong pattern of manipulation and lying. She said the lying had gotten worse over the years, more elaborate and harder to disprove. She thanked me for calling, admitted she'd been avoiding dealing with her mother's situation because it was too painful and complicated. I told her I understood family difficulties, that I just wanted to make sure Ruth got help before she hurt herself or someone else. When we hung up, I sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, staring at my cold tea and hoping I'd done enough to bring Beth down here. The next morning, I woke up to movement outside my father's bedroom window. I looked out and saw Ruth in the front yard, going through his garden shed like she owned the place. She was loading clay plant pots into her truck bed, then went back for his expensive riding lawnmower. She moved casually, not even trying to hide what she was doing. I grabbed my phone and took photos from behind the curtain, zooming in to capture her face clearly in each shot. Every instinct screamed at me to run outside and confront her, to physically block her from taking anything else. But I forced myself to stay inside and keep photographing. I needed Ruth to feel safe and unsuspecting. If she knew I was planning something bigger than just changing locks, she'd prepare defenses I couldn't counter. Let her think she'd won. Let her get comfortable with her lies and her false witnesses. Beth would be here soon, and Ruth wouldn't see that coming. I spent the rest of the day walking around the neighborhood, knocking on doors and talking to people I'd known for years. I kept my approach gentle and concerned, asking if anyone had noticed Ruth seeming confused lately. I mentioned that she'd been entering houses and taking things, framing it as memory problems rather than theft. Luis Schneider, who lived 4 houses down, stopped trimming his hedge when I brought it up. He said Ruth had tried to take his snowblower last winter, claiming her husband had loaned it to him years ago. Luis had been confused because he'd never met Ruth's husband, and by that point the man had already left her. Ruth had gotten angry when Luis refused to hand over the snowblower, accusing him of being a liar and a thief. Luis had thought she was just being difficult, but now he wondered if something else was going on. Austin Haynes stopped by my father's house that evening while I was sorting through papers in the dining room. He knocked softly and waited on the porch, looking uncomfortable. When I answered, he admitted he'd been missing tools from his garage for months, maybe longer. Expensive power tools, hand tools his own father had given him, all gradually disappearing. He'd never suspected Ruth because she was always so friendly and helpful, always asking how his family was doing and offering to water plants when he went on vacation. He said he felt stupid for not realizing sooner, for blaming his teenage son instead. I assured him that Ruth was very good at manipulation, that she'd been doing this for years based on what I was discovering from other neighbors. Austin looked relieved to hear it wasn't just him, that other people had been fooled too. 2 days after my call to Beth, my phone buzzed with a text message. Beth had found the power of attorney paperwork in her files, and it was still valid because it had never been formally revoked. She was taking emergency leave from work, and would drive down this weekend to assess her mother's situation in person. She asked me not to tell Ruth she was coming. She wanted to see everything without her mother preparing excuses or hiding evidence. I texted back confirming I wouldn't say anything to Ruth. Then I sat on my father's couch and felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since he died. Beth was coming. Ruth's daughter was coming with legal authority, and no idea what her mother had really become. I looked out the window at Ruth's house and allowed myself the smallest smile. I drove to the funeral home the next afternoon with my father's will in my purse and a folder of documents proving I was his legal next of kin. The building was old brick with tall windows, the kind of place that had probably handled funerals in this town for 50 years. Inside smelled like flowers and furniture polish, and the funeral director met me in a quiet office with dark wood paneling and soft lighting. He was maybe 60 with gray hair and kind eyes, and he shook my hand gently before gesturing to a chair across from his desk. We went through the service options, picking out a casket and discussing the burial plot my father had purchased years ago next to my mother. I was holding it together pretty well until the funeral director asked about my father's military service and whether I wanted a flag ceremony. Something about that question broke me open and I started crying right there in his office, big, ugly sobs that I couldn't control. The funeral director handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I fell apart, not rushing me or looking uncomfortable. When I finally calmed down enough to speak, I apologized and tried to explain about Ruth stealing everything while I was grieving. He listened without interrupting, then told me he'd seen families fight over belongings many times, and it always made the grief worse. He extended my payment deadline by 3 weeks, and assured me that everything would be handled properly regardless of what was happening with my neighbor. I was thanking him and gathering my papers when Ruth walked into the funeral home. She came right into the office without knocking, acting like she belonged there. Ruth looked at me with this expression of fake concern and told the funeral director that she needed to discuss some important details about my father's service. The funeral director stood up and politely asked who she was, and Ruth introduced herself as my father's closest neighbor and dear friend. She said my father had discussed his funeral wishes with her many times over the years, including specific hymns he wanted and a military ceremony with full honors. Ruth pulled out a handwritten list from her purse and tried to hand it to the funeral director, claiming these were my father's exact instructions. I sat there frozen for a moment, watching her perform this lie with complete confidence. The funeral director took the paper but didn't look at it, instead turning to me and asking if I wanted to include any of these suggestions. Ruth interrupted before I could speak, saying my father had been very clear that I wouldn't understand what he wanted, because I'd been absent for so long. The funeral director's expression changed slightly, becoming more formal and distant. He told Ruth very clearly that he takes direction only from legal next of kin, and I was listed as my father's daughter and executor on all the paperwork. Ruth's face went red, and she started arguing that family meant more than paperwork, that she'd been there for my father when I wasn't. The funeral director remained calm and professional, repeating that he could only work with me on the arrangements. Ruth grabbed her list back and stormed toward the door, muttering something about ungrateful daughters who didn't deserve good fathers. I heard her footsteps loud in the hallway, then the front door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. That night, I lay in my father's guest room bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite being completely worn out. My mind kept going over the 8 months I'd spent caring for him, how I'd given up my apartment lease and quit my job to move back home. I remembered sitting with him through every doctor's appointment, learning to manage his medications and help him to the bathroom when he got too weak to walk alone. The hospice nurse had taught me how to keep him comfortable during the worst pain, and I'd held his hand through nights when he couldn't sleep because of the fear. Ruth had stopped by maybe once a week for 10 minutes, usually when she wanted to borrow something or gossip about the neighbors. She'd never offered to help with his care, never sat with him during the bad days, never even brought him a meal. Now she was telling everyone she'd been his devoted caretaker while painting me as some absent addict daughter who only showed up to steal his belongings. The lies made me so angry I couldn't think straight, but underneath the anger was this deep sadness that Ruth was trying to erase everything I'd done for my father. She was rewriting those 8 months like they didn't happen, like all the love and care and sacrifice meant nothing compared to her occasional 10-minute visits. I got up around 3 in the morning and made tea I didn't drink, sitting at my father's kitchen table and looking out at Ruth's dark house next door. The morning of my father's funeral arrived gray and cold. I put on the black dress I'd bought specifically for this day, the fabric feeling stiff and uncomfortable against my skin. My phone buzzed with a text from Beth saying she was an hour away and asking if we could meet somewhere private before she confronted her mother. I suggested the coffee shop near the highway, the one Ruth never went to because she said their coffee was too expensive. Typing out the response made my hands shake slightly because I knew I was using Beth to get revenge even if Ruth genuinely deserved consequences. Part of me felt guilty for manipulating Beth into coming down here, for framing Ruth's theft as memory problems instead of deliberate cruelty. But then I thought about my father's military medals in Ruth's house, about his coin collection and tools and all the things she'd stolen while I was planning his funeral. The guilt faded into something harder and more determined. Beth looked completely worn out when she walked into the coffee shop 40 minutes later. She had her mother's same nose and jawline, which made this whole situation feel more complicated than I wanted it to be. We sat in a corner booth away from the other customers, and I pulled out my phone to show her the evidence I'd been collecting. The photos of Ruth loading my father's belongings into her truck were clear and detailed, showing her face and the items she was taking. I showed Beth the locksmith's invoice for the fraudulent lock change and screenshots of text messages where Whitney and her other drinking buddies discussed backing up Ruth's story. Beth scrolled through everything with shaking hands, her face getting paler with each new photo. She stopped on one image showing Ruth carrying out my father's leather recliner and just stared at it for a long moment. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wet. She told me her mother has always been a liar and a manipulator, that she'd learned as a child never to fully trust anything Ruth said. But she never thought it would escalate to actual theft from a dead man's house, especially not from someone who'd just lost their father. Beth asked about him, what he was like and how he died, and I found myself telling her about the 8 months of caregiving in more detail than I'd planned. I described the good days when he could still joke around and tell stories, and the bad days when the pain was so intense he couldn't speak. I told her about holding his hand in the hospital during those final hours, how he'd squeezed my fingers one last time before he stopped breathing. Beth reached across the table and squeezed my hand, apologizing for what her mother had put me through during my grief. She said she was ashamed to be related to someone who could be so cruel, and I could see she genuinely meant it. We spent the next hour planning exactly how Beth would handle confronting her mother. She wanted to show up at Ruth's house unannounced this evening while Ruth was home, and I would stay away so Ruth didn't realize I'd contacted her daughter. Beth said she wanted to search the house for stolen items, because if my father's belongings were there, she was certain other neighbors' things would be too. She told me about growing up with a mother who took things that didn't belong to her, small items at first like pens from stores or sugar packets from restaurants. Over the years, it had gotten worse. But Beth had moved away and tried to pretend her mother's problems weren't her responsibility. Now she felt guilty for not intervening sooner, for letting Ruth's behavior escalate to this point. I assured her this wasn't her fault, that Ruth was a grown woman making her own choices. We exchanged phone numbers and Beth promised to text me updates throughout the evening. When we left the coffee shop, I felt this strange mixture of hope and dread, knowing that tonight would either solve everything or make the situation even worse. My father's funeral was the hardest day of my entire life. I stood at his grave watching them lower the casket into the ground, knowing his belongings were scattered through Ruth's house next door. while she spread lies about me to anyone who'd listen. My aunt and uncle had driven in from out of state, and they stood beside me looking furious when I explained quietly what Ruth had done. My uncle offered to go confront Ruth himself, but I told him Beth was handling it, and we needed to let the plan work. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of the funeral director's voice reading prayers, and I kept thinking about all the things my father would never see or do. He wouldn't meet any grandchildren I might have, wouldn't see me get married or buy a house or accomplish anything else with my life. Ruth had stolen his final months of peace by making me fight for his belongings instead of just grieving like a normal person. Then Ruth showed up wearing my father's favorite scarf, the blue wool one he'd worn every winter for 20 years. She walked right up to the grave and started crying loudly, making this huge scene about losing her dear friend. Several neighbors who didn't know the full story moved closer to comfort her, and Ruth leaned into their sympathy while shooting me hostile looks over their shoulders. I watched her performance with my teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached, forcing myself to stay calm and not cause a scene at my own father's funeral. Ruth talked about how much my father had meant to her, how he'd been like family, how she'd missed their long conversations about everything. Every word was a lie, but the neighbors ate it up because Ruth had always been good at playing the victim. My aunt grabbed my hand and held it tight, probably sensing I was about to lose control. After the service ended, people started coming up to offer condolences. Whitney walked over with this fake sympathetic expression and mentioned how my father had promised Ruth so many things because she was like family to him. She said it was such a shame when families fought over belongings instead of honoring the deceased person's wishes. I smiled politely and told Whitney I was sure we'd get everything sorted out through proper legal channels, watching her confident expression falter slightly. She clearly wasn't expecting me to stay calm, wasn't prepared for me to have a plan beyond just yelling at Ruth. Whitney mumbled something about hoping it all worked out and walked away quickly, probably to report back to Ruth that I wasn't falling apart like they'd hoped. That evening, I sat in my aunt's hotel room staring at the wall while she talked on the phone with my uncle, and I couldn't focus on anything except the image of Ruth wearing my father's scarf at the funeral. My phone buzzed with a text from Beth saying she was at her mother's house, and Ruth seemed shocked to see her, asking why she'd driven all this way without calling first. Beth texted again a minute later saying Ruth was making excuses about the boxes in the spare room, claiming she was storing things for neighbors who needed extra space. I texted back asking if she'd found any of my father's belongings yet, and Beth said she was still looking, but the spare room had a lot of stuff piled up. My aunt hung up the phone and asked if I wanted to order dinner, but I told her I wasn't hungry and kept checking my phone every few minutes waiting for updates from Beth. Another text came through saying Ruth was getting defensive and asking why Beth was going through her things, and I could picture Ruth's face getting red the way it did when anyone questioned her. My aunt sat down next to me on the bed and put her arm around my shoulders, telling me everything would work out and justice would be served, but I didn't feel confident about anything anymore. An hour passed with no new messages, and I started worrying that Ruth had convinced Beth I was lying about everything, that maybe Beth would side with her mother over some stranger who'd called out of nowhere. Then my phone rang with Beth's number, and my hands shook as I answered, hearing her voice tight with anger telling me I needed to come to Ruth's house right now. She said what she'd found was worse than either of us had imagined, and she needed me to see it with my own eyes, and I told my aunt I had to go and grabbed my keys. I drove to Ruth's house with my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, parking on the street and walking up to the front door where Beth was waiting. She looked pale and angry in a way that made her seem 10 years older, and she grabbed my arm and led me inside without saying anything. Ruth was sitting on the couch in the living room with her arms crossed, glaring at both of us. But Beth ignored her and pulled me down the hallway to the spare bedroom. The door was open, and I stopped in the doorway because the room looked like some weird thrift store with stuff piled everywhere, boxes stacked against the walls and items covering every surface. I saw my father's television in one corner next to his leather recliner, and his tools were scattered across a workbench that didn't belong to Ruth. Beth was taking photos with her phone and telling me she'd been documenting everything for the past hour, while Ruth sat in the living room crying and making excuses. I walked into the room slowly, looking at all the different items that clearly came from multiple houses, seeing decorations and electronics and random household things that had no connection to each other. Beth pointed to a box on the shelf and told me to look inside, and when I opened it, I found my father's military medals lying on top of his coin collection. I had to sit down on the floor right there because the relief hit me. So hard I couldn't stand, and at the same time I felt this burning rage that Ruth had hidden these precious things in her spare room like they were garage sale junk. Beth put her hand on my shoulder and promised we were going to return everything to its rightful owners, and I looked up at her face and realized she was genuinely shocked by what her mother had become. She helped me stand up, and we went back to the living room where Ruth was still sitting on the couch, and Beth told her mother they needed to talk about all the stolen items in the spare room. Ruth started crying and saying these were all gifts or things she was storing for people who needed help, but her explanations kept changing every time Beth asked a specific question. Beth asked about my father's medals, and Ruth claimed he'd given them to her before he died. Then she said she was storing them for me. Then she said she couldn't remember where they came from. I watched Ruth switch between crying and making excuses and getting angry that her own daughter was siding with neighbors over family. And Beth's voice stayed calm but firm as she pointed out that Ruth's detailed explanations about each item proved she knew exactly what she'd been doing. Ruth tried to use the cognitive decline story I'd spread, saying she couldn't remember taking things. And maybe she was confused, but Beth shut that down by reminding her that confused people don't hide stolen items in spare rooms and create elaborate lies about storing things for neighbors. I pulled out my phone and called Luis asking if he was missing anything besides the snowblower, and he said he'd come right over to check. 10 minutes later, Luis knocked on the door, followed by Austin, who'd been at Luis's house when I called, and both men looked stunned when Beth led them to the spare room. Luis immediately spotted his tools on the workbench, along with the snowblower he'd been looking for since last winter, and Austin started going through the boxes, finding tools that had belonged to his late father. Austin picked up an old hammer with his father's initials carved in the handle, and his eyes filled with tears, and he had to step out of the room for a minute to pull himself together. Word must have spread fast through the neighborhood because within an hour there were 6 more neighbors at Ruth's house, all of them identifying their missing belongings and taking photos with their phones. Jacqueline came in with her husband and found her daughter's bicycle leaning against the wall in the spare room, and she had to go outside because she was so angry thinking about how Ruth had let her child cry over that lost bike for 2 years while it was hidden next door the whole time. Ruth tried to get up from the couch and leave, but Beth blocked the door and told her mother she needed to face what she'd done and help return everything to the proper owners. Ruth started screaming that everyone was ganging up on her and she was the real victim, that her own daughter had turned against her and brought strangers into her house to steal her belongings. The neighbors were documenting everything with their phones, and several people were already calling the police to report the thefts. And I stood there watching Ruth's performance, knowing she'd finally been caught and couldn't talk her way out of this. A police officer arrived about 20 minutes later and started taking statements from all of us while Ruth sat on her couch crying and refusing to speak without a lawyer. The officer was professional and thorough, writing down everyone's account of what they'd found and how long their items had been missing, and Beth provided her power of attorney paperwork, showing she had legal authority to make decisions about her mother's property and medical care. The officer looked clearly disturbed when he went into the spare room and saw the extent of Ruth's collection, and he came back out shaking his head and saying, "This would be investigated as multiple counts of theft." I explained to him how Ruth had started stealing from my father's house the morning after he died, while I was still at the hospital, and the officer's expression got even more serious, as he took detailed notes. He spent the next hour taking photos of everything in the spare room and creating a list of items that needed to be returned, telling us we could start the recovery process once he'd finished documenting all the evidence for his report. Beth touched my arm while the officer was still photographing items in the spare room, pulling me toward the hallway where Ruth couldn't hear us from her position on the couch. Her eyes were red from crying, and she kept twisting her hands together like she didn't know what to do with them. She said she was sorry for everything her mother had done, that maybe if she'd stayed in better contact, this whole situation could have been stopped before it got so bad. I shook my head and told her this wasn't her fault at all, that Ruth was a grown woman who'd made deliberate choices to steal from grieving families and take advantage of vulnerable neighbors. Beth shouldn't carry guilt for her mother's cruelty because Ruth had spent years building this pattern of theft and lies, and no amount of phone calls from 2 states away would have changed who Ruth chose to be. Beth wiped her eyes and nodded, but I could see she was still struggling with the weight of discovering what her mother had become. The officer called us back into the living room to go over the next steps for filing formal reports, and Ruth stayed silent on the couch, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. That night around 11, my phone lit up with a text from Beth saying she'd checked into a hotel because she couldn't bear to sleep in her mother's house after everything she'd seen today. She asked if I wanted to meet for breakfast tomorrow morning to plan out how we'd handle returning all the stolen items to their rightful owners. I texted back that breakfast sounded good, and suggested the diner on Main Street at 8. Then I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how strange it was that Beth had become an unexpected ally in all this. Despite the awful circumstances that brought us together, I appreciated having someone who understood how complicated this situation was, someone who'd seen the spare room full of stolen belongings and knew exactly what kind of person Ruth had been for years. My phone buzzed again with Beth confirming the time and place, adding that she was grateful I'd called her even though my reasons weren't entirely pure. I sent back a simple thank you and tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying the day's events over and over. The next morning, Beth was already sitting in a corner booth when I arrived at the diner, 2 cups of coffee waiting on the table. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept much either, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and dark circles under her eyes. We ordered breakfast, and then Beth started talking about growing up with Ruth's manipulation and lying, how every day had been filled with drama and false accusations against neighbors or family members. Her father had finally left after 30 years of marriage because he couldn't take the constant chaos anymore, the way Ruth would create problems out of nothing and then play the victim when people got upset with her. Beth said she'd been in therapy for years trying to process her mother's emotional abuse, learning to set boundaries and recognize when Ruth was trying to manipulate her into feeling guilty. Seeing that spare room yesterday full of stolen items had been like watching all her childhood fears about her mother get confirmed in the worst possible way. She'd always suspected her mother took things that didn't belong to her based on weird comments Ruth made over the years, but she'd convinced herself she was being paranoid because of their difficult relationship. Now she knew her instincts had been right all along, and her mother had been stealing from people for decades. We spent the next hour creating a systematic plan for returning items to neighbors, starting with things that were clearly identifiable like Austin's tools with his father's initials, or the bicycle that Jacqueline's daughter could recognize. The more generic items like hammers or garden supplies would require people to come look and describe what they were missing before we could hand anything over. Beth pulled out a notebook and started making lists organized by neighbor, writing down what we'd already identified and leaving space for additional items people might claim. She told me she was taking a full month of leave from her job at the hospital to deal with her mother's situation properly, which included arranging for the cognitive evaluation the officer had mentioned and possibly looking into supervised living facilities. I asked if Ruth would cooperate with any of that, and Beth laughed bitterly, saying her mother would fight every step of the way. But the power of attorney gave Beth legal authority to make decisions about Ruth's care whether she liked it or not. We finished our breakfast and agreed to start the recovery process this afternoon, giving Beth time to go back to Ruth's house and create a more detailed inventory of everything in the spare room. I spent the afternoon at my father's house going through the belongings we'd recovered from Ruth's spare room. And I kept breaking down crying because these were the things I should have been sorting through as part of normal grief instead of fighting to get them back from a thief. My father's watch was in a small wooden box along with his wedding ring and a tie clip my mother had given him years ago. I picked up the watch and held it close to my face, breathing in the scent of leather and my father's cologne that still clung to the band. The grief hit me so hard I had to sit on the floor clutching the watch against my chest while sobs shook my whole body. Ruth had stolen so much more than just objects from me. She'd taken away the peaceful mourning process I should have had after losing my father. Instead of spending these weeks remembering him and processing my loss, I'd been forced to scheme and manipulate and fight just to recover his belongings. I stayed on the floor for almost an hour going through his military medals one by one, remembering the stories he told me about his service and feeling the weight of everything Ruth had tried to take from his memory. That evening around 6, Beth called to say Ruth's lawyer had finally gotten involved after Ruth spent all day trying to reach him. The lawyer had advised Ruth to return everything immediately and cooperate fully with the police investigation because the evidence against her was overwhelming and fighting it would only make things worse. Ruth had admitted to taking things from neighbors over the years, but insisted she'd always planned to return them eventually, that she was just holding on to items for safekeeping. Beth said the lawyer sounded deeply skeptical of Ruth's excuses based on their phone conversation, especially when Beth described the organized way everything was stored in the spare room like a personal collection. The lawyer had strongly recommended Ruth undergo psychiatric evaluation to determine if there were underlying mental health issues beyond simple greed, which might help explain her behavior to the court if charges were filed. Beth sounded drained talking about the conversation. Like each new detail about her mother's theft made her more tired and sad. The next day, Beth and I set up a schedule for neighbors to come by Ruth's house in organized time slots to identify and retrieve their belongings. We'd posted notices on the neighborhood social media page explaining the recovery process and asking people to bring any documentation or photos that might help identify their items. Ruth stayed locked in her bedroom the entire time, refusing to participate or even acknowledge what was happening in her own house. Beth looked more exhausted and heartbroken each time someone walked into the spare room and discovered something else her mother had stolen, watching neighbor after neighbor realize Ruth had been lying to them for years. Luis came by at 10 and found not just his snowblower, but also a set of expensive wrenches he'd thought he'd lost during his move 3 years ago. He shook his head in disbelief and told Beth he was sorry she had to deal with this situation, that it couldn't be easy discovering your mother was a thief. Austin showed up at 11 with his adult son, both of them quiet and tense as Beth led them to the spare room. Austin went straight to the workbench where his father's tools were laid out, and his hands started shaking when he picked up the old hammer with his dad's initials carved deep into the wooden handle. His son put a hand on his shoulder, and Austin just broke down crying, explaining between sobs that his father had died 5 years ago, and these tools were the most precious inheritance he had from him. He told us he'd accused his own son of losing the tools after they went missing from his garage, which had seriously damaged their relationship and created tension between them for months. Now he had to admit he'd been completely wrong because Ruth had stolen them during one of her visits to borrow sugar or ask about his lawn care routine. His son looked angry and sad at the same time, helping his father gather the tools into boxes while shooting dark looks toward Ruth's closed bedroom door. Jacqueline arrived around 2 with her 7-year-old daughter, the little girl holding her mother's hand and looking confused about why they were at the neighbor's house. Beth brought them to the spare room, and the girl's eyes went wide when she saw her pink bicycle leaning against the wall exactly where she'd left it 2 years ago. She asked her mom why the bike was here, and why hadn't they just come to get it before now. Jacqueline knelt down and told her daughter that sometimes adults make mistakes and take things that don't belong to them. But the important thing was they got the bike back now and everything was okay. I watched Jacqueline's face while she talked to her daughter and saw pure rage in her eyes when she glanced toward Ruth's bedroom door, the kind of anger that comes from watching your child suffer unnecessarily because of someone else's selfish choices. By the end of the week, we'd returned items to 11 different neighbors, and the police investigation had expanded significantly because the total value of all the stolen goods exceeded $10,000. The officer who'd taken the initial reports came back to update us on the case, explaining that Ruth could face serious felony theft charges given the amount involved and the number of victims. Beth stood next to me listening to the officer detail the potential consequences, and she looked absolutely devastated, her face pale and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I knew she understood her mother had brought all of this entirely on herself through years of deliberate theft and manipulation, but watching your parent face criminal prosecution was still painful no matter how much they deserved it. The officer asked if we had any questions, and Beth just shook her head silently, staring at her mother's closed bedroom door like she was trying to understand how things had gotten this bad. The next week, I loaded my father's belongings into a rental truck with Beth's help, making trip after trip between Ruth's house and my father's place until everything was back where it belonged. I spent an entire Saturday organizing his things in the house where he'd lived for 30 years, opening boxes and finding his reading glasses still folded on top of a book he'd been reading before he got too sick to focus. His favorite coffee mug sat wrapped in newspaper, the one that said "World's Best Dad" that I'd given him. When I was 12 and I held it against my chest and cried until my aunt arrived with lunch and found me sitting on the kitchen floor surrounded by unpacked boxes. She helped me sort through everything methodically, placing his military medals back in their display case and arranging his coin collection in the cabinet where it had always been kept. My aunt told me I'd done the right thing fighting for what was mine even though the whole situation was heartbreaking and shouldn't have been necessary, and I nodded but couldn't stop thinking about how I should have been doing this as part of normal grief instead of recovering stolen property from a thief. We worked until evening, putting his tools back in the garage and his books back on the shelves, and when we finished, the house looked exactly like it had before my father died, except now it felt empty without him in it. 3 days later, Beth called to tell me Ruth's cognitive evaluation results had come back from the psychologist. I met her at the same coffee shop where we'd planned the recovery operation, and she slid a manila folder across the table with a tired expression on her face. The report showed early signs of dementia consistent with Ruth's age and medical history, but the psychologist had included a detailed note explaining that Ruth's theft pattern clearly predated any cognitive decline based on the timeline we'd provided. The doctor wrote that Ruth's behavior appeared rooted in personality disorder and impulse control issues, rather than memory problems, and that she'd likely been stealing from neighbors for years, while fully aware of what she was doing. Beth looked at me across the table and said this confirmed what we'd both suspected, that her mother knew exactly what she was doing and just used any excuse available to justify her behavior. I read through the evaluation twice, focusing on the part where the psychologist noted Ruth showed no remorse during the interview and instead blamed everyone else for misunderstanding her intentions. The report would be shared with the police as part of their investigation, and Beth said her mother's lawyer was already trying to use the dementia diagnosis as a defense, even though the evaluation specifically stated it wasn't relevant to the theft timeline. A week after getting the evaluation results, I received a call from the prosecutor's office asking me to come in for a meeting about pressing charges against Ruth. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s named Ms. Nichols, who had Ruth's case file spread across her desk when I arrived, and she explained that I needed to decide whether I wanted to pursue criminal prosecution or accept restitution and a restraining order. She walked me through both options carefully, explaining that criminal prosecution would mean Ruth facing potential jail time and a permanent record, while restitution would require Ruth to pay back the value of everything she'd stolen but wouldn't result in criminal charges. I asked how long I had to decide, and Ms. Nichols said I should take a few days to think about it, but she needed an answer by the end of the week because other neighbors were also pressing charges, and she wanted to coordinate all the cases together. That evening, I called Beth to talk through my decision, and she told me she'd support whatever I chose because she wasn't trying to protect her mother from consequences, but rather wanted to ensure justice was served appropriately. Beth said her mother had spent years manipulating people and avoiding responsibility, and maybe facing real legal consequences was exactly what Ruth needed, even if it was painful for everyone involved. I decided to pursue full prosecution after spending 2 sleepless nights thinking about everything Ruth had done. She'd shown no remorse for stealing from my dead father, had actually tried to destroy my reputation by calling me a drug addict, and had manipulated an entire neighborhood while I was grieving. I called Ms. Nichols on Thursday morning and told her I wanted to press full charges, and she said my case combined with the other neighbors' complaints made for a strong pattern of predatory behavior that the court would take seriously. The prosecutor explained that the preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which would give me time to focus on grieving my father properly now that his belongings were back where they belonged. Ms. Nichols also mentioned that Ruth's lawyer was already trying to negotiate a plea deal, but she wanted to wait until after the preliminary hearing to see how strong their case looked in front of a judge. I thanked her for taking the case seriously, and left her office feeling like I'd made the right choice, even though part of me felt guilty for potentially sending an elderly woman with early dementia to jail. The following weekend, Beth came over to help me sort through my father's papers and documents that Ruth had stolen from his filing cabinet. We spread everything across his dining room table and organized it into piles, finding his handwritten will, clearly leaving everything to me, along with his birth certificate and military discharge papers. At the bottom of one stack, I found a folder of letters my father had written during his final months, pages filled with his shaky handwriting expressing how grateful he was for my care, and how much my presence meant to him during his illness. I read through them with tears streaming down my face while Beth sat quietly beside me, and one letter specifically mentioned how he worried I was sacrificing too much by moving home to care for him, but that he'd never felt more loved in his entire life. He wrote about watching me make his meals and help him to the bathroom and sit with him during the worst pain, and he said I was the best daughter any father could hope for, and he was proud of the person I'd become. Reading his words about how much my presence meant to him made me cry harder than I had since his funeral, but it also validated that I'd done the right thing caring for him and fighting to recover his belongings from Ruth's theft. 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing, Ruth started trying to contact me through mutual neighbors asking me to drop the charges. Jacqueline stopped by one afternoon to tell me Ruth had called her claiming she was sorry and didn't mean any harm and that she was just confused and made mistakes. I told Jacqueline I appreciated her passing along the message, but I wasn't interested in hearing Ruth's apologies, and Jacqueline nodded and said she understood completely given everything Ruth had put me through. Luis came by the next day with a similar message, saying Ruth had knocked on his door crying about how the charges were ruining her life, and she just wanted everyone to forgive her. I explained to Luis that Ruth had multiple opportunities to return things or apologize before she was caught, and her remorse only appeared after facing legal consequences. Austin called that week to tell me Ruth had left a note in his mailbox, begging him to talk to me about dropping the charges, and he'd thrown it away because he was still angry about his father's stolen tools. I ignored all of Ruth's attempts to contact me because I knew she wasn't actually sorry for what she'd done. She was just sorry she'd been caught and was facing punishment. Over the next few days, several neighbors stopped by to thank me for exposing Ruth's theft, because they'd been missing items for years and had blamed themselves for being careless or forgetful. An older woman named Margaret from 3 houses down told me she'd thought she was losing her memory when her garden tools disappeared last summer, and finding out Ruth had stolen them was actually a relief because it meant she wasn't going senile. Luis came by again with his wife to thank me properly, bringing a plate of homemade cookies and telling me the neighborhood felt safer now, knowing the truth about Ruth. He said he was grateful I'd been brave enough to fight back instead of just accepting the loss, and that my father would be proud of how I'd handled everything. Even people I barely knew stopped me when I was checking the mail to say they appreciated me standing up to Ruth, and several mentioned they'd always felt something was off about her, but couldn't put their finger on what it was. The support from the neighborhood made me feel less alone in my grief, and it helped knowing that recovering my father's belongings had also helped other people get justice for their losses. 3 weeks before the hearing, Beth asked me to meet her for coffee again at our usual spot. She looked exhausted when she arrived, and she told me she'd been working with a social worker to arrange for Ruth to move into an assisted living facility that had memory care services and supervision to prevent further theft. Beth explained that the facility had experience with residents who had impulse control issues, and they could provide the structure and monitoring her mother needed while still allowing her some independence. Ruth was fighting the move hard, calling Beth daily to scream about being abandoned and betrayed, but Beth had legal authority through the power of attorney, and believed it was the best option given her mother's pattern of behavior and early cognitive decline. She showed me brochures for the facility, a nice place about 20 minutes away with gardens and activities, and I could see the guilt and sadness in her eyes, even though she knew this was the right decision. Beth said the facility had an opening in 6 weeks, which would be right after the preliminary hearing, and she'd already paid the deposit to hold the spot. The preliminary hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in late April, and I arrived at the courthouse with Beth and several other neighbors who'd filed complaints against Ruth. Ruth sat at the defense table with her lawyer looking small and frail, wearing a cardigan and glasses that made her look like someone's sweet grandmother instead of a thief. The judge reviewed all the evidence methodically, including photos of the stolen items, statements from multiple victims, and the cognitive evaluation that showed Ruth's theft predated any memory issues. Ruth's lawyer tried to argue that his client was confused and hadn't meant to take things permanently, but the prosecutor presented a timeline showing Ruth had been stealing from neighbors for at least 5 years, based on when people first reported missing items. The judge asked Ruth directly if she understood the charges against her, and Ruth nodded but didn't speak, keeping her eyes down on the table in front of her. After an hour of testimony and evidence presentation, Ruth's lawyer asked for a recess to discuss a possible plea deal, and the judge agreed to reconvene after lunch. During the break, Ms. Nichols explained that Ruth's lawyer wanted to negotiate a deal that would include probation, restitution to all victims, mandatory counseling, and the assisted living arrangement Beth had already set up. The prosecutor said she was willing to recommend the plea deal to the judge because it would ensure Ruth faced consequences while avoiding a lengthy trial that would drain everyone's energy and resources. I agreed to the plea deal because I felt relieved that justice was served without requiring months of court dates and testimony, and the other neighbors who were present also agreed it was a fair resolution. 2 days after the hearing, I called a realtor to start the process of selling my father's house. I couldn't bear the thought of living next door to Ruth even with her moving to assisted living, and I needed to move forward with my life instead of staying trapped in the neighborhood where everything reminded me of his death and her theft. The realtor was a friendly woman who'd sold several houses on our street, and she walked through my father's place taking notes and photos while explaining that the property should sell quickly, given the neighborhood and condition. She suggested listing it at a price that would generate multiple offers, and I agreed, because I just wanted it sold fast so I could close this chapter of my life. My aunt came over that evening while I was signing the listing paperwork, and she suggested I use some of the proceeds to take a trip somewhere my father had always wanted to visit, as a way to honor his memory and help myself heal. She reminded me that my father had talked for years about visiting Ireland, where his grandparents had come from, and maybe going there would give me a chance to feel close to him again, while getting away from all the painful memories here. I listed the house with the realtor on a Thursday morning, and by Saturday afternoon we had 3 offers above asking price. Beth called me that same evening asking if she could come by Sunday to help pack my father's things, and I agreed because sorting through everything alone felt overwhelming. She showed up at 9 in the morning carrying coffee in boxes, wearing old jeans and a sweatshirt that made her look nothing like the exhausted woman I'd first met at that coffee shop. We worked through the living room first, wrapping my father's books in newspaper and filling boxes while talking about nothing important, just easy conversation that felt comfortable after everything we'd been through together. Beth stopped when she found my father's photo albums and sat on the floor flipping through pages, asking me questions about the people in the pictures, and listening to my stories about family vacations and holidays. She told me she was grateful I'd called her despite my reasons for doing it, that she'd needed someone to push her into finally dealing with her mother's problems instead of avoiding them from 2 states away. The supervised living situation would actually help Ruth more than letting her keep stealing and lying, Beth said, because at least now her mother would have structure and people watching to keep her from hurting others or herself. We packed steadily until lunch, filling 12 boxes with books and kitchen items and linens, and Beth's presence made the whole process feel less sad and more like closing one chapter before starting another. She asked about my plans after the house sold, and I told her about my aunt's suggestion to visit Ireland, which made Beth smile, and say that sounded perfect for processing grief in a healthier way than spending months fighting with her mother had been for me. 2 weeks later, I stood at my bedroom window watching the moving truck pull up to Ruth's house, workers loading furniture in boxes while Beth supervised from the driveway. Ruth came out once looking small and angry, glaring at her daughter before climbing into Beth's car for the drive to the assisted living facility. I felt satisfaction watching the truck pull away, but also unexpected sadness because Ruth had been my father's neighbor for 15 years, and now she was leaving in disgrace. My phone buzzed an hour later with a text from Beth saying her mother was settled in her new room and still refusing to speak to her, but the staff seemed experienced with difficult residents and promised to keep Beth updated on adjustment progress. Beth sent a photo of Ruth's room, a clean, bright space with a window overlooking gardens, and I felt relieved knowing Ruth would be supervised and unable to steal from anyone else. The house closing happened exactly on schedule 3 days later, and I signed papers at the title company, while the young couple who'd bought it waited eagerly in another room. They had 2 little kids who'd been excited about the backyard and the big tree for climbing, and knowing the house would have children's laughter instead of Ruth's toxic presence made me feel good about selling. I used part of the proceeds to pay off my father's remaining medical bills, watching the balances drop to 0 and feeling like I was honoring his memory by handling his affairs properly. The rest went into savings while I figured out my next steps, and that evening I booked flights to Ireland for 2 weeks starting in June. The trip to Ireland felt like stepping into my father's stories, walking through small villages where distant relatives still lived, and visiting the church where his grandparents had married before immigrating to America. I spent my days exploring countryside and evenings in pubs, listening to old men tell stories about local history, and every conversation made me feel closer to understanding where my father came from. A cousin I'd never met took me to the family farm that my great-grandfather had worked before leaving for better opportunities, and I stood in fields that my ancestors had plowed, feeling connected to something bigger than my grief. I visited graves in a small cemetery, finding headstones with my family name dating back 200 years, and I cried thinking about how my father had always wanted to make this trip, but never found the time. The Irish relatives welcomed me warmly, sharing photos and documents about family history, and I filled a notebook with stories to preserve for future generations. One evening, while sitting in a cottage kitchen drinking tea with a second cousin, I got an email from the prosecutor saying Ruth had completed her first month of probation successfully and paid her first restitution installment to all victims. The message felt distant and unimportant because I was thousands of miles away, focusing on healing rather than revenge, and I realized I was ready to move forward instead of staying stuck in anger about what Ruth had done. Beth sent photos during my second week in Ireland showing Ruth at the assisted living facility, participating in art classes and eating meals with other residents. Her mother looked calmer in the pictures, Beth noted, without the opportunity to scheme and steal from neighbors. Beth visited every Wednesday, and their relationship was slowly improving now that boundaries were firmly in place, and Ruth faced real consequences for her actions. I texted back saying I was glad things were getting better, and Beth responded that she'd learned more about setting healthy limits with her mother in these few weeks than in years of therapy. When I returned home, jet-lagged and emotionally exhausted from 2 weeks of processing grief in a foreign country, I started looking for apartments in a different part of town where I could build a fresh life. My aunt met me for coffee and pulled up listings on her phone, pointing out neighborhoods near parks and walking trails where I could process my continuing grief in peaceful surroundings. We spent 3 weekends visiting apartments until we found a bright one-bedroom place with big windows and hardwood floors, close enough to my aunt's house that she could visit easily, but far enough from my father's old neighborhood that I wouldn't be constantly reminded of his death and Ruth's betrayal. I moved into the new apartment in late July, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture while my aunt directed placement and made suggestions about curtains and rugs. The storage unit still held my father's belongings that I hadn't sorted through, and I spent August evenings going through boxes and deciding what to keep versus what to donate. I kept his military medals and the photo albums, his favorite books and the watch he'd worn every day, but most of his clothes and household items went to charity. The local veterans organization sent a truck to pick up his military books and memorabilia, and the coordinator thanked me repeatedly saying these items would help other veterans and their families. Knowing my father's things would serve a purpose instead of sitting in storage made me feel like I was honoring his memory in a positive way. Austin stopped by my new apartment one Saturday morning with his son, both of them carrying a card signed by multiple neighbors, thanking me for exposing Ruth and helping them recover their stolen belongings. Austin told me that he and his son had repaired their relationship after the misunderstanding about the tools, that they'd had a long conversation about trust and assumptions, and now they talked regularly instead of avoiding each other. His son apologized for the years of distance between them, and Austin admitted he should have investigated the missing tools instead of immediately blaming his kid. Knowing something good had come from this awful situation with Ruth helped ease some of my lingering anger, and I hugged Austin goodbye feeling lighter than I had in months. Beth and I met for dinner at a restaurant halfway between our cities in September, sitting at a quiet table near the window and talking about how this experience had changed both of us in ways we never expected. She was setting better boundaries with her mother and feeling less guilty about their complicated relationship, visiting weekly but not letting Ruth manipulate her into feeling responsible for problems her mother created. Beth said therapy was helping her understand that she couldn't fix her mother's personality disorders or make up for years of poor choices, that the best she could do was ensure Ruth stayed in a safe environment with proper supervision. I told Beth about learning to process grief without letting anger consume me, how the trip to Ireland and the new apartment and the distance from that neighborhood had helped me remember my father with love instead of rage about what Ruth had stolen. We ordered dessert and talked about staying in touch, about meeting up every few months to check in and support each other through the ongoing work of healing from family trauma and complicated loss. 6 months after my father died, I opened the storage unit where I'd kept the boxes of his papers and photos that I couldn't handle sorting through earlier. The air inside smelled like dust and old paper, and I carried 3 boxes to my car and drove them back to my apartment where I spread everything across my living room floor. I found letters he'd written to my mother before she died, photos from his time in the army, and pictures of me as a kid sitting on his shoulders at the park. My hands didn't shake as much as they used to when I touched his things, and I spent the whole weekend creating a memory book with the best photos arranged in order from his childhood through his final months. I included pictures of him in his uniform looking young and strong, images of him holding me as a baby, and photos I'd taken during those 8 months when I moved home to care for him. The last page had a picture of us together from 2 weeks before he died, both of us smiling even though we knew time was running out, and I wrote a caption about how grateful I was for every moment we'd shared. Ruth had tried to destroy the truth of our relationship with her lies about me being an absent addict daughter, but this book preserved the real story for anyone who wanted to see it. I made copies for my aunt and uncle, and I kept the original in a special place on my bookshelf where I could see it every day. The prosecutor's office sent a letter in early October confirming Ruth had completed all her restitution payments to me and the other neighbors, and her probation was moving forward without any violations or problems. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table and read through the formal language about case closure and legal satisfaction of claims, and I filed the letter in a folder with all the other documents from this nightmare. I sat there for a while expecting to feel happy or satisfied that Ruth had paid for what she did, but instead I just felt tired and ready to move on with my life. The money she'd paid back couldn't replace the months of anger and stress, and knowing she was in assisted living following the rules didn't make my father any less dead or erase the pain of fighting for his belongings while I should have been grieving. I closed the folder and put it in a drawer where I wouldn't have to look at it anymore, and I decided to focus completely on healing instead of holding on to what Ruth had done. I started volunteering at a hospice organization in November after seeing a flyer at the grocery store asking for people with caregiving experience. The coordinator interviewed me and seemed moved when I told her about caring for my father during his final months, and she said my personal understanding of end-of-life challenges would help families who were going through similar situations. My first assignment was sitting with an elderly woman whose daughter worked during the day, and I held her hand and read to her from her favorite books while she drifted in and out of sleep. The work brought up painful memories of my father's last days, but it also felt meaningful to use what I'd learned to support other people facing loss and grief. I volunteered twice a week, and the coordinator told me families appreciated having someone who understood what they were experiencing instead of just offering empty sympathy. Some days were harder than others when a patient reminded me too much of my father, but I kept going because transforming my pain into something that helped others felt like the right way to honor his memory. A year after my father's death, I drove to the cemetery on a bright March morning carrying fresh flowers and a thermos of coffee. I sat on the grass next to his headstone and told him about the trip to Ireland, where I'd walked through villages his grandparents came from, about my new apartment with the big windows, and the park nearby, and about my volunteer work, helping families navigate the same challenges we'd faced together. I told him I'd fought for what was right when Ruth tried to steal everything, and I'd made sure his belongings went where they belonged instead of being sold by a thief. The morning air was quiet except for birds singing in the trees, and I felt him with me in that peaceful moment like he was listening to everything I said. I knew he'd be proud that I'd stood up to Ruth and recovered what she'd stolen, but I also knew he'd be glad I'd chosen healing over staying angry forever. I'd kept his military medals and his watch and the things that mattered most, and I'd let go of the bitterness that could have poisoned the love and care we shared during those final 8 months when I moved home to be with him. I finished my coffee and stood up to leave, touching his headstone one more time, and promising to keep living a life that honored his memory through service to others instead of hatred for the person who'd tried to take everything away.